All right, I think we're ready to get started. Welcome everyone to the fourth installment of the PRIF Learning Series. Today's session will feature a presentation on the PRIF study on forced labor among domestic workers in Casablanca, Morocco. I'm Dr. Ridhi. For those who don't know me, I'm the Associate Director of the Center on Human Trafficking Research and Outreach at the University of Georgia School of Social Work and coordinator of the PRIF, of the Prevalence Reduction Innovation Forum. As usual, we'll have a Q&A session after this main presentation, so you can use the Q&A function to ask any questions, and our speakers will address them after their main presentation. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. David Okesh, Director of the Center on Human Trafficking Research and Outreach and of the PRIF. Dr. Okesh, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lydia, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We've learned that with Zoom, you just never know what time it is. And sometimes when we speak with colleagues from Australia, it's even worse. You never know what to say. Good midnight or something like that. So welcome actually to the fourth installment of our learning series. And today, researchers from NORC at the University of Chicago will present findings and lessons learned about estimation strategies used to measure forced labor among domestic workers in Morocco. And presenters are Ridhi, Sahai, Katrina from Justice Information Resource Network, and Kareem Kysia from NORC at the University of Chicago. We also have Sheldon Zhang from the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and I also understand that Kyle Vincent will be here to cheer the team. The team from NORC explored the prevalence of domestic servitude in the Anfa and Maarif regions of Casablanca, Morocco, using two strategies. The first one was Mark-Recapture, and the second one was the link tracing sampling, or LTS. In addition, NORC fielded a randomized control trial embedded in the LTS component to understand if there are differences in prevalence estimates when using cell phone-based versus in-person interviewing techniques. NORC implemented the study in collaboration with local data collection partner, Clear Vision Consulting, a local research with a local research coordinator, Mr. Ragbi Aziz, at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. For those of us who've been coming for this series since we began, you know how successful this series have been, and we look forward to seeing you there as we explore the strengths and limitations of current prevalence sampling and estimation techniques in human trafficking research across the globe. Welcome, the NORC team.
Great. Thank you, David. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Ridhi Sahai, and I'm a research scientist at NORC and the project manager for the PRIF Morocco study. As David mentioned, I'm joined by my colleagues, Kareem, Kysia, Katrina, Sheldon, Zhang, and Kyle Vincent. And we will be presenting key findings in terms of prevalence estimates and programming and policy learnings from our implementation of the study between 2020 and 2023. Again, we implemented the study in collaboration with the University of Massachusetts Lowell and our local data collection partner, Clear Vision Consulting, as well as local researcher, Dr. Ragbi Aziz. So to start with and just give you an idea of our project goals and objectives, for this study, we had two primary objectives. First, to explore ways to estimate the prevalence of exploitative labor among domestic workers in Morocco, given limited prior studies. And our second objective was to apply two methods to estimate the prevalence to facilitate comparisons between these approaches. And the two methods we used was Mark-Recapture experimentation and the Vincent link tracing sampling method, which we'll describe in upcoming slides. And to give you a brief study background, Morocco has a history of both domestic and migrant trafficking. Despite this, prior to 2016, Morocco lacked any legislation on trafficking specifically, and trafficking was legally classified as kidnapping. The 2016 law on trafficking in human beings created a legal framework for trafficking in people and improved protections for children and adults who were vulnerable to trafficking. More recently, in 2021, the government introduced new legislation with making it illegal for people under 16 years of age from engaging in domestic work. So 16 and 17-year-old individuals were permitted to engage in domestic work with the consent of their parent or guardian. Funded by the Prevalence Reduction Innovation Forum program, this study applied two strategies to study and estimate the prevalence of domestic servitude in urban receiving areas of internal trafficking of female domestic workers in Casablanca, Morocco. Specifically, we looked at the Anfa and Maarif municipalities of Casablanca as part of our study. And to give you an overview of the methods that we use. So in this study, the team evaluated two strategies which are commonly used to measure hard-to-reach populations. First was the Mark-Recapture sampling method, or the MR method, and the second one was the Vincent link tracing sampling method within a well-defined geographical area of Anfa and Maarif in Casablanca, Morocco. So we also included a randomized controlled trial, or an RCT, to assess the impact of survey modality. So whether survey is administered face-to-face or via cell phone. We explored this through our RCT, and this RCT was embedded into the second method, which was the VLTS method. Our local data collection partner, Clear Vision, had extensive experience collecting data from vulnerable populations and leveraged their experience for this study. We focused on key urban receiving areas of Anfa and Maarif. Those were our study areas. And initially, our study was split into two phases. The first was a formative assessment phase, which included a piloting of field procedures, recruitment, as well as testing of survey instruments in November and December of 2022. That was then followed with phase 2, which was our main data collection, where we leveraged learnings from our formative assessment and conducted the main data collection between January and March of 2023. And just briefly going over to the two methods. So the Mark-Recapture method was our first method that we use in our study. Mark-Recapture has been a well-established strategy for estimating the size of hard-to-reach, rare, and elusive populations. These sampling methods have gained much attention among researchers who study stigmatized populations. And until very recently, the Mark-Recapture method was one of the few viable methods researchers could use for estimating the size of hidden populations for human trafficking estimation. As part of the Mark-Recapture approach, we prepared a sampling frame of all the sites where domestic workers were likely to congregate or pass by, such as public transit points, so bus stops, taxi stations, tram stations, etc., clinics, supermarkets, grocery stores, and parks. We identified a total of 1,400 gathering points, out of which we covered 203, and we selected 203 of these to collect data from over a six-week period. We finally arrived at a sample size of 1,038 for the Mark-Recapture method. And then the second method was the Vincent link tracing sampling methodology. So this is a variation of the respondent-driven sampling method, which is a well-known strategy for recruiting and studying hidden populations. To mitigate some of the limitations with a conventional respondent-driven sampling method, we incorporated a new sampling strategy, which is, again, aimed at achieving a moderate initial respondent sample with a lot of entry points. And the seeds that are selected, which are the first set of domestic worker respondents, this is then followed by a systematic recruitment procedure, or we strategically choose some of these seeds or initial set of domestic worker respondents based on recommendations from local organization contacts. In terms of measuring and defining a potential victim, we used two operational thresholds, which was used across, the different PRIF themes. For prevalence estimation, respondents who met either of these thresholds, so threshold 1 or threshold 2, were considered potential victims of human trafficking. Threshold 1 consists of 2 indicators, so having to perform sex acts to pay off debt or receive wages, and the second one, which is losing freedom of movement due to surveillance or isolation. Threshold 2 consists of more indicators. It consists of about 10 indicators that fall into several categories of abuses pertaining to recruitment, employment practices and penalties, personal life and properties, degrading work conditions, and respondents who reported experiencing at least 2 or more of these 10 indicators were considered potential victims. So again, for the purpose of our estimation, respondents who met either threshold 1 or threshold 2 were considered potential victims of human trafficking. I'll now hand things over to my colleague, Katrina, who will go over some of the key findings from our study. Katrina, over to you.
So our Mark-Recapture or MR data collection procedure reached a final sample of 1,067 captures across 1,038 unique individuals. With this strategy, we estimated that 27.75% of the sample, or an estimated 28.7% of the domestic worker population, could qualify as victims of forced labor when we're looking at both combined thresholds. For threshold 1, which is the more stringent criteria, we observed that just about 14% of the sample, or an estimated 14.28% of the population, could be considered victims of forced labor under this threshold. For threshold 2, we observed that 25.9% of the sample, or about 27% of the population, could be considered victims of forced labor. Now, several Mark-Recapture estimation strategies were applied for estimating the domestic worker population size in the 2 municipalities, with the most conservative estimate being a point estimate of 9,846, while a sparse mean squared error estimation procedure gave a point estimate of 19,845. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. Now, our VLTS data collection procedure reached a final sample of 989 individuals. We used 3 separate analytical approaches with this data set, and the most conservative estimate based on the Thomson 2020 resampling method for network sample weighting is also known as the NE4NS estimation method. So that's the most conservative one. And that estimated that 32.56% of the sample, or an estimated 34.15% of the domestic worker population, could qualify as victims of forced labor when combining both thresholds. For threshold 1, again, the more stringent one, we observed that 20.42% of the sample, or an estimated 19.87% of the population, were considered victims under this threshold. For the second threshold, we observed that 30.23% of the sample, or 32% of the population, could be considered victims of forced labor. Now, based on the VLTS data set, several strategies for population size estimation, such as those presented in some prior research, were applied, and all of these estimates typically gave us population estimates around 4,000. Some were slightly below and some were slightly above, but all of these different estimation strategies generally gave us a population size of around 4,000. Now, when comparing both of these strategies, we found that both estimation strategies detected sizable rates of trafficking violations. The VLTS strategy produced a smaller estimated population size, but estimated higher rates of forced labor violations. Whereas the MR strategy generated a much larger estimated population size, again, around 9,800 or 19,000, depending on which strategy was used, but slightly lower rates of forced labor violations. But in sum, regardless of which estimation strategy method was applied, forced labor violations were fairly common among domestic workers in the 2 municipalities in Casablanca. Because our variant of VLTS was able to find more individuals of forced labor violations than the MR method, This demonstrates its possible utility for studying the more sensitive domains of this hidden population. Now, regarding the demographics, domestic workers in both of our samples were around 40 years old on average. For the VLTS sample, more than half of female domestic workers were married and close to 3/4 had at least one child. Regarding respondents' level of education obtained, over half of both samples reported that they had received no education. And almost all of the workers in the MR sample reported that they are originally from Morocco, whereas 100% of the VLTS sample reported that they are from Morocco. So we had no foreign domestic workers in the VLTS sample. No, you're fine, you can go to the next one. So the most common method of controlling workers' personal lives, as reported by workers in both samples, was religious retribution. For degrading working conditions, we found that 11.4% of MR workers and 18.6% of the VLTS workers reported that their current employer has required them to be available day and night or to work extra hours without adequate pay. And more than 1/3 of workers in both samples reported that any employer has required them to work extra hours without pay. Regarding restricting freedom of movement, confiscation of identity papers by a current employer was reported by about 18% of the MR sample and 22.35% of the VLTS sample, with a higher proportion of both samples saying that this has ever happened to them by any employer. On restricting freedom of movement, 12.3% of the MR sample reported that their current employer has kept them under surveillance, while this was reported by 18.1% of the VLTS sample. And again, many more have experienced this in their lifetime by any employer. Reports of violence, especially by their current employer, were generally low in both samples. Now, the VLTS sample also asked about why they stayed at their current job if they had experienced any of these workplace abuses. And the most common reason was that there were no better job options. Now I'm going to turn this over to Kareem.
Hello, everyone, and thank you to Ridhi and Katrina for their presentations. As part of this study, we thought it would be interesting to design an RCT to go along with the link tracing component. So we've been talking amongst ourselves and thought that it would be really important to understand whether reaching out to respondents through cell phones would have an impact on our final calculations, with the idea that if there wasn't a large impact, there might be a way to design studies that are more cost effective in the future. So we changed up the survey modality for each of these. We gave RDS respondents, we assigned them to either cell phone based data collection, face-to-face based data collection, or respondent choice, where they got to choose between doing a cell phone or a face-to-face type survey. You can see from the different modalities, we've got about 300 people in each of the modalities for the study. Next slide. And what we found was that the randomized assignments made no difference statistically or substantively in the prevalence rates of forced labor. The same patterns were observed on nearly all constituent items under the two main threshold indicators. So again, you can see the thresholds that we talked about before. And with indicator 1, face-to-face interviews gave us about 20% forced labor, mobile phones also 20%, and the choice was also 20%. For indicator 2, again, which is the less stringent indicators, we got in the face-to-face around approximately 30% for all of the modalities. And looking at either indicator or indicator 1 or indicator 2 combined, again, we found very similar rates across all 3 modalities that we assigned to the study. Next slide. So just let's go back one slide. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure there wasn't more. So this was very encouraging in that we found that there was little difference depending on the modality in terms of our calculations for forced labor. I think it's also really important to to understand this within the context of different countries. So for example, in Morocco, there's a high penetration of cell phone use, which made this type of study possible and could make a pure cell phone based study possible as well. That might not be the case in other countries, and I can talk about that when we talk about our limitations as well. Next slide. So when we first designed this study, we wanted to focus in very closely on child domestic workers. However, we did have a long formative assessment phase where we went in and looked at the laws, the context, did qualitative interviews at the beginning of the study, and found that there were new laws in Morocco that had come about just in the last couple of years, in which child domestic work was made illegal. And those laws were highly known in the communities and were applied pretty stringently. So what we found out is it made it almost impossible to find actual child domestic workers, because it was so illegal now, and people were also very scared to report if they had children in their houses. So because of this formative assessment, we pivoted to looking at adult workers. The second change is initially we attempted to compare time location sampling with the Vincent link tracing sampling for estimating the prevalence. Again, though, during pilot testing, we observed very low response rates at the primary TLS venues, which made it difficult to reliably measure the frequency of venue attendance, which is a critical component of using a TLS estimation strategy. So we switched at that point again, pivoted when we found, okay, this isn't going to work. How can we pivot to make it work? And applied the Mark-Recapture as our estimation approach to compare against LTS. And I have to just thank David and all of the teams that this study and the entire PRIF was kind of designed to allow groups to do a lot of initial research and then pivot if they needed to when they found difficulties in the field. So some of the limitations and lessons learned include our data collection was limited to open space recruitments. For example, street intercepts, we did not do a household survey, so we weren't going house to house. As with many different types of trafficking, slave-like or grossly exploitative working conditions may have been missed. So for instance, we often say the worst of the worst are in their homes. They can't leave their homes, which means we're never going to measure them, robustly. Data collection was also limited to daylight hours. So we then systematically missed out on those who might have traveled outside of those hours. The other important point is we applied a trauma-informed approach to this and developed an extensive trauma-informed research training with multiple modules, which enumerators received to allow them to interact with respondents with basic emotional first aid techniques and understanding exactly how to identify trauma in respondents. And this is something we use in all of our human trafficking related research and our gender-based violence research as well. And we've actually developed internally a very robust toolkit around trauma-informed research that we're hoping to make public in the next couple months. The sampling design did not capture a sizable number of foreign domestic workers. So I think that's another limitation there. And that community might be in more exploitive situations. In terms of time location sampling, we find that TLS is very expensive when compared to other methods. It's methodologically cumbersome and assumes a heavy concentration of the target population in a relatively small geographic area. It also requires a lot of upfront time in order to get it right, and that can add to the costs associated with that method. And we don't necessarily recommend it for most situations. In terms of policy recommendations, we think awareness building to mobilize domestic workers to understand their rights and entitlements is important. However, awareness building by itself is not going to be super effective. It's important to build awareness building into a more holistic, approach to the issue. Looking at legal mechanisms to compel employers to implement workplace benefit entitlements. Given how successful the Moroccan labor laws around child domestic work were, this is a very good environment to increase, those laws to look at domestic work at large rather than just children, and it could be extremely effective. And that's hand in hand with improved monitoring from government agencies. And then again, increased service provision from as my colleague Sheldon, I love to quote him. He's got he says it very well that if you've got a pot of boiling water and you dump it in your bathtub, you can measure a change in the temperature from time 1 to time 2. But if you take that same pot of boiling water and dump it in your swimming pool, there's going to be no change over time. And that's the whole idea here. There is service provision in Morocco, but of course the problem is so large and the money being put in it is so small that you're just not going to see a impact over time. And we are happy to answer questions. I want to thank the entire team. It was really a team effort overall, and a great study.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's not in the Q&A, but I do see here that Casey posted a question. I've been surprised by the average age of workers in most of the studies. Can you speak a little bit to the distribution?
So I think that this, and then I'll let Sheldon and Kyle jump in as well. When doing, so again, VLTS, honestly, is just respondent-driven sampling, which allows you to look more closely at the network connections between people. But with any respondent-driven sampling, it relies on the seeds that you initially get. And most likely in this case, the initial seeds were older than expected. And when they nominated other people to be part of the project, they nominated people they knew, which was in their same age range. Going back, what I think we could have done is if we had been able to identify that pattern earlier on, to limit the number of seeds from that age group and increase the number of seeds in younger age groups to compensate for that. That's something we've done in other studies when we start seeing patterns like this early on in the study. Sheldon or Kyle?
I'll just jump in and speak to the overall distribution of the age groups. We did see like a large age range, so as low as 18 and up to age 72. So there was a wide variety there. And so we found 40s in the middle, about your, standard, I guess, adult age. But yeah, we saw people that were younger and older. So there was a spectrum there still.
Thanks, Kareem and Katrina. Could you also speak a little bit more about the risks across these age groups?
I don't think we did an analysis across age groups, or at least not one that I could speak to off the top of my head. I would have to look back at some of our codes and some of our full report to see if I have anything to add on that. I think when we did some exploratory analyses as far as risk factors, age was, I think it was significant, but the effect was very, very small, like 0.01 or 0.001. So there was maybe some effect there, but not much. So I'm sorry, I don't have a lot to share to expand on that.
Katrina, remember we actually ran risk and protective factors, and age did not show up to be a predictor.
Yeah, it was
Risk. Yeah.
small.
Back to
Anything.
the age thing, we found similar things with the Tunisian sample also. The domestic workers were the average age is around 40. In Tunisia, actually a little bit older. You could say this an artifact because we set the limit at 18 and above, so we automatically exclude anyone younger than 18. And it may also be just the genuine reflections of the population, because the consistency was quite striking between the Moroccan sample as well as the Tunisian sample.
Thank you, Sheldon. I actually have a quick question. So for the RCT, where you had the three groups, the cell phone, the face-to-face, and then the respondent choice, yeah, the 292 folks, could you tell us the distribution of for respondent choice? What was there a method? Like, did most of the people in the respondent choice choose cell phone or face-to-face, or was it split down the middle?
So I'm not sure if we have the exact split available at the moment, but I think from our data collection partner, they had flagged that most of them preferred the cell phone modality, just because it's easier for these domestic workers to just interview at any time, even outside of daylight hours or anything like that. So I know that from like our data collection partner, Clear Vision, had flagged that there seemed to be a slightly greater preference for cell phone based interviewing, just because of the convenience factor.
Yeah, and I have a follow-up question on this same slide here. So under either indicator 1 or 2, mobile phone about 31%, and then the others are close to 34%. Was this mobile phone method, the confidence intervals, was it within the other two methods, face-to-face and choice? Do you have the, yeah, it looks like, I'm not sure there's a significant difference between, but it's like 31% for the mobile phone, and then 34 for face-to-face, and close to 34 again for choice. Was this mobile phone, was it within the confidence intervals of the other two? Or vice versa?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Kyle, do you have any input on this? Is there something you'd like to share?
No, I'm so sorry, I don't.
Yeah, I don't have the confidence intervals on that. I mean, I could, not that I could pull up quickly. I could run my code again and tell you and probably email it to you in like 10 to 15 minutes, but I don't recall what those confidence intervals were.
Okay.
We're just looking at, you can just look at the p-value and also the percentages across. Very likely you'll see significant overlaps between all the confidence intervals, CI value.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, with the high p-values, we're seeing some overlap in the confidence.
Yeah,
They're quite,
high
they're
p-value.
very close to it, so almost equal across.
Right.
Okay. Lydia, I think Casey has another question.
Okay. All right. So don't feel bad for taking our time, Casey. You have every right to ask a question. So Casey asked another question. I'm curious if you looked at age at first migration or age at entry into domestic work. I know the report discussed how prevalence was lower among women who resided in one place for a longer period.
Katrina, from what I remember, I don't believe we have information on age at forced migration, or I'm not sure if we had this question about at what age they entered into domestic work. Is there any additional information we can flag tied to this?
Internal migration. Yeah, so I'm not sure about internal migration. So like years worked in Casablanca.
I don't think we have those measures.
Mhm.
We did ask whether you spend money for recruitment. I think those were, yeah, we did not ask migration specific questions.
We asked how long they've worked in Casablanca or how long they've worked in like their specific neighborhood where they currently work. But not about their age.
Okay, thanks. And thank you, Casey, for the question. So both this study as well as the study in Tunisia on domestic work both found that the methods captured very few foreign domestic workers, right? So for this one with the Mark-Recapture, it was 99%. From Morocco with VLTS, it was 100%. And the same with the Tunisia study. I remember it was very low percentage. Do you think that, well, like for the Mark-Recapture, like were these public venues that in general had few foreigners there, or is it just the domestic workers who are foreign may not? But basically, were the venues in general venues that, looking back, you think were less likely to capture foreign workers?
So I believe that when we selected the venues, we selected them under the general understanding that domestic workers writ large would be there. And I don't think that we dug deeply about whether there would be different venues for different types of domestic workers and migrant ones, especially. And then again, we learned a lot from the study, I have to say. And then again, and we've applied it to other studies since then, is once we should have identified early that we weren't capturing that population and then purposefully seeded into that population to ensure that we captured it. Another important thing when doing any sort of RDS or VLTS type study is to take that time at the beginning to understand who are the subgroups of interest that might not be easily captured, and then identifying ways to seed into those communities.
That's great to hear that you're using that and thinking about ways to from the get-go, try to capture like more of the foreign workers. Do we have?
Yeah, there's one question here. Somebody has an interesting question. Please indicate the best sampling method for a country where cell phone network is a bit difficult.
So I'll let, I can talk to that and then let Sheldon add to it maybe, or anybody. So if you're talking about in terms of domestic workers, so first of all, it's important to understand different forms of trafficking require different sampling approaches. And there isn't one technique that's gonna capture all forms of trafficking. In terms of domestic workers, I think if you're looking at adult domestic workers, this RDS technique can be really, really helpful and work well, because I think those communities are connected together in lots of interesting ways. We're also doing a child domestic worker study currently in Nigeria and Liberia. And that one's focused on, again, it's focused on children, and we're using a household-based sampling design for that, which I think is extremely successful for that population, right? Because the children aren't as likely to be in these venues as adult domestic workers. In terms of if cell phones are not as common in those areas, we can still do the RDS study. They simply have to give out coupons, and it's a little more difficult to reach people, but still doable to do a RDS type study. Sheldon, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I think it really depends on how you want to frame your research questions. If the questions is if you want to study the domestic workers in general, the targeting question will direct the researchers to design the sampling strategies in specific ways. And as we also learned in Tunisia, because these two countries are very culturally very similar to one another, I think the foreign domestic workers are working in an entirely separate labor sector. These two do not overlap, so which makes a public venue sampling strategies less effective in capturing certain segments of the domestic worker population. In terms of which method is the most appropriate for the type of population to study, I think really we have learned a lot of lessons. I think bottom line is, well, in reality, is oftentimes the kind of strategies you can do is oftentimes constrained by the kind of money you have. But there are certainly ways to combine the different sampling strategies to target a more comprehensively at the population you're getting at. But I think the initial targeting question or the overarching questions will invariably guide or misguide the sampling strategies. Yeah, on that end, I mean, I really want to give a big shout out to UGA as well as JTIP for allowing us to try out these different methods, especially allowed us to build in an RCT component, which actually, to me personally, has solved a major methodological questions I've had for a long time. For those of us who were trained in the traditional sociology methodologies, we view it as a taboo to mix interviewing modalities. You never do that, but apparently this, provide findings that point to the other direction. So I'm very pleased with this finding.
Yeah, I agree with Sheldon and Kareem actually on this. So this was the purpose of PRIF. So underlying this question, the major philosophy, it's not just where self or network is a bit difficult. One of the underlying issues in PRIF was to try to find out what method works best under what circumstance and with what population. And we've answered some questions, but also we've raised more questions, right? Because we've raised more questions. So if you listen to Kareem, they presented some of the findings and also lessons learned and also what not to do when. So really, this question that you just asked, I think this is Finja Sharif. I really appreciate the question because this is what PRIF was about. But I also saw that you have a follow-up question about children, about doing that same study with children within school age. And we've done some of that research in Sierra Leone and Guinea. The approach that we used basically was a very direct method where we spoke to the head of household because think of IRB difficulty sometimes with directly intervening children. So we did ask the heads of households about the children. And also the studies have interviewed adults and asked them about their childhood experiences. So yes, we have answered some questions, but as every time you come for the PRIF Learning Series, you still find that we still have a few questions that need to be answered moving forward. And of course, I echo JTIP. I echo what Sheldon has done, JTIP, for really being bold and funding this project.
And just to add to what we've been saying, I think the really interesting part is how we've learned how to mix, as Sheldon mentioned, mix some of these methods together, right? So that you can, so for instance, they're strong in one way, weak in the other, find another method that's strong in the way that the first method is weak and it compensates for that. Or for instance, the link tracing that we used here is really looking at RDS and then using a Mark-Recapture technique on top of that in order to allow us to look at both percentages, prevalence percentages, as well as population sizes. And that's something that was that's extremely helpful and has been successful. Or using initial probability-based sampling techniques, and then adding either an n-sum component on top of that or an RDS component on top of that as well has also been extremely successful.
Mhm.
Right. I don't see any other unanswered questions. Oh, wait, maybe there's one. Yes. Could you please discuss the implications of the study's findings for addressing the issue of TIP in that context? And how can NGOs or local government utilize these findings in their work?
So I think that there's two ways to address that. One, I think it's really important a lot of times to get the raw numbers out there for policy makers to understand what the extent of the issue is. And I think the other way, and we didn't present it in this presentation, is to take an indicator-based approach at looking at these issues. So not only do we have these prevalence figures, but we can report indicator by indicator. You know, what are the conditions that domestic workers are under? And you can see which conditions are most, you know, are found the most within Morocco, for example, right? And it could be, doesn't, you know, the employer, you know, doesn't let me contact my family. And then you can design programs that address those specific, right? So for instance, here are some violations and you can see the percentages, right? So for example, looking at this slide, you know, working extra hours, yes, it's an issue, but it doesn't seem to be as big an issue as confiscation of identity papers. So there's something that you can focus on if you want to have a larger impact. One issue is more valence than the other issue, which is why it's important to look indicator by indicator at those items. The other thing that I think is important, and this was definitely a methods type project, is even in methods types projects, build in a component that's looking at interventions, what type of interventions people want or what they need. So even if it's not the main focus of the study, you're still collecting data that NGOs can use, right? So maybe they're not so much interested in which method works better than another method, but then they can look and see what type of intervention data you collected, and they can understand what people are saying their needs are on the ground. And I'm a big advocate for adding that to every prevalence survey out there.
Exactly. And also to add that, you know, when I was talking to somebody and I was saying that if you look at our prevalence reports, which could be around 200 pages, the prevalence part is only like 2 to 3 pages. Everything else, because most of our studies are mixed methods, everything else is about the risk factors, the pull and push factors, you know, the community. And that so I think it is very important for us as a community to understand prevalence in the context of the social, economic, you know, even political factors in a particular country, right? Because that prevalence can change anytime. So today, if we went back and did this study, depending on what has happened in the country, maybe now there are more rules against, you know, blah, blah, blah. And you might find that the number will change. But I think to understand the factors around that number, whether it is the same or not, is mostly important in terms of interventions. So we really try to understand the people who are being trafficked, and also the environment, you know, why are they being trafficked? How are they being trafficked? You know, who is doing it? Because our interventions do not, you know, as I think as you've said here, it is about government, NGOs, everybody. Sometimes we need a very holistic approach in interventions here. So most of the prevalence studies that I see, even the PRIF teams did a very good job. They didn't just give us numbers, you know, they had many other factors that they tried to, they collected data on many other things. And we did ask them to do that. And so I think that number always should be put in context. So prevalence studies are actually, the prevalence part to me is usually just maybe 5 to 10%. And then the other 90% speaks about many of the things associated with prevalence and trying to understand the population, the households, the economy, you know, and other issues.
Yeah, I want to add to what Kareem mentioned. I think the indicators approach is actually very powerful because of its implications for intervention planning. Because we have these indicators can point directly on where the major problems are. Of course, collectively, they can produce a trafficking rate or prevalence estimation, but those specific indicators do have implications for IDR purposes. Yeah, it just matter. But right now, I mean, it's a pity because all 6 teams have to do the same 12 indicators. Ideally, for IDR purposes, it'd be good to have additional indicators. We do have a lot more. I mean, UGA came up with a 39, but it was through quite a bit of a struggle because of the diversity in the populations and countries. We settled on 12, but I think more indicators will help greatly refine our findings and actually be very helpful for intervention planning. I think overall, when we have 2 sampling methods that produce very similar prevalence estimates, that gives us much confidence in interpreting the overall prevalence situation in that country. For advocacy purposes, it's great. I think the downside is when 2 methods produced very similar findings, it's hard for us to determine which method is more valid than the other. The best way we can go about evaluating 2 methods is usually which methods cost less money or more efficient to carry it out, assuming both produces similar outcomes. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Sheldon, and agreed. Pauline asked, and I know we've already spoken a little bit about the foreign workers. Why do you think the study didn't capture the population? I know Kareem mentioned, that these venues were just not venues that, captured the foreign domestic workers, and what might be adjusted or done differently in a future study. And Kareem, you also mentioned that you've already started to do that differently. Could you briefly?
Yeah. I could give an example. So,
thank you.
And again, I want to thank JTIP for the funding because they also helped fund this study. We were looking at mine workers in Brazil, and during the formative phase of the research, when we were just gathering information and data, it became apparent that that although there were indigenous populations that were involved in mining, that they would not be located in the same places that most other miners would be located in. So we very purposefully sampled and seeded within indigenous communities that were close to mines to ensure that we had a sample from that group, represented in our data, and that we could speak to that. If we hadn't done that, and just let the seeds go the way they go, then we would have gotten almost 0 indigenous peoples as part of that. And so it's the same situation here. We should have identified where areas that, so for instance, we knew that there's a lot of domestic workers from Cote d'Ivoire in Morocco. Where do they congregate? Right? Where do they get together? Or if they have days off, where do they go? And then ensure that we go to those places and seed into those communities.
Yeah, so formative research is really important.
Again, we'll play up the importance of formative research to everybody. I think that the way it was done 10, 15 years ago is you get a project, you go in, and the expectation is you're going to run a survey within 4 weeks of hitting the ground or something, right? Design everything, get all the things together, go and survey. And what we've learned is, no, what you need is and it can be an extensive period of time at the beginning to really understand the context that you're running into and ensure that you're measuring things correctly, the questionnaires are designed correctly, you really understand the context that you're working in.
Yeah, just to echo Kareem, it's Casey. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my video, my computer today. But yeah, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Just want to echo that too. And I think that just like you said, like before we used to look at projects and be like, oh, you had to start on day 1. And now we're trying to give kind of more time for that. I think the field is moving in that direction, and it is wonderful to see. And I think not even just the beginning, but kind of throughout the project too, kind of this iterative, like kind of learning, kind of validating some of the things, your findings, going back. I know that's really hard, like you mentioned, like funding restrictions and things like that. It's always like a challenge, but really been impressed with the way that like projects have been able to do this, and just kind of overall just really like happy to see kind of the field moving in that direction. I think we're in a totally different place than we were like 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Casey. Do we have any other questions or comments? No? All right. David, any comment from you or from the team, or think we've said?
So I know the waves, I think in Kyle Vincent's words are beginning to recede, over time. If you look at when people come into Zoom meetings, the first 5 minutes are few, and then the 15 minutes to 25 minutes, there's a huge wave. And then over time, we are beginning to see some attrition. So the waves are reducing. So before the wave is completely dissipated, we are going to close our meeting, and we really thank the NORC team, Kareem and everybody. Thank you so much for a very wonderful presentation. And of course, we want to thank Andre, who faithfully sends, those Zoom links and everything. Plus this meeting, everything is speak and span when you have Andre. And of course, I also want to thank Lydia, who's coordinated this work from the beginning. And last but not least, of course, the Department of State Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking Persons for funding this work and also for supporting it to its completion. As we said, we're still working on our special issue. It was supposed to come out this past quarter, but we have a few delays with a few teams. So we are really planning to have this special issue out in the next quarter. Thank you very much and have a great April.